Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining today's webinar, Results That Matter. The topic today is an important one, sharing individual study data return back with participants. So we'll refer to this throughout our conversation today as IDR. You might hear that mentioned. We'll be showcasing and speaking to how CISCRP and Biogen work together with a fantastic group of patients and care partners to better understand what data collected during the course of a clinical trial really mattered most to them and how this data should best be communicated back to study participants. So without any further ado, we can dive into co-creating individual study data reports together with patients. On the next slide, I'd like to just take a moment and introduce our panel here today. Happy to kick things off. My name is Jasmine Masulo. I'm the Senior Director of Research Services here at CISCRP, and I will be your host today. I've had the pleasure of working with Biogen and facilitating the Patient Community Advisory Board that will be referencing later in our conversation, so really excited to be with you all today. With that, I'd like to pass it on next to my CISCRP colleague, Kim.
Thanks, Jasmine. My name is Kim Edwards. I am the Senior Director of Health Communication Services at CISCRP, based in the Boston area, and looking forward to the discussion today. Pass it over to Israel.
I'm Israel Robledo. I'm out in Midland, Texas. I was diagnosed with Parkinson's 19 years ago and have been advocating pretty much the whole time for clinical trial participation and quality of life issues.
Thanks so much. Mariana?
Hi, my name is Mariana Foos. I'm a Principal Clinical Data Steward at Biogen. I'm also based in Boston, and I'll pass it to Sudipta.
Thanks, Mariana. My name is Sudipta Chakraborty. I am the head of a Health Literacy and Plain Language Center of Excellence at Biogen. I am home-based in Nashville, Tennessee.
Excellent. Thanks, everybody. Looking forward to our conversation today. On the next slide, we just prepared a brief agenda for everybody so we can walk through what we're going to be speaking to today. So this is our agenda for today's discussion. So first, we will turn to Kim and Sudipta, and they'll provide an overview of the current individual data return landscape for us to help set the stage for our conversation. Next, I'll introduce the UPCAB, which stands for Underrepresented Populations Community Advisory Board, or UPCAB for short. As I mentioned, it's a phenomenal group of patients and care partners that have come together since 2020 to discuss various different topics related to research and drug development. And I'll share a bit about what they had to say on the topic of individual data return. Mariana will then take us through how Biogen utilized feedback from the UPCAB to help refine their individual study results template or data return template. And then we'll round out our conversation speaking with Israel, who, as he just introduced himself, is a patient advocate representing the Parkinson's disease community, who also served on the UPCAB. And so he'll speak a little bit to his experience and what he thinks matters most when returning individual study data back to participants. And then finally, time permitting, which hopefully we'll have some time for, we'll also open up to Q&A from our audience. So feel free to put questions in the chat as you listen on. So with that, I will move on to the next slide, and I'll turn it over to my CISCRP colleague, Kim Edwards, to kick off the conversation about the individual data return landscape.
Absolutely. Thanks, Jasmine. So just to level set on what we're talking about when we're, referring to IDR, individual data return, we're talking about participant-specific data that's collected throughout a trial. So things like labs, imaging, scans, adverse events, what treatment they actually received during the trial, and any genomic findings. And just in general, IDR is certainly gaining momentum. There is strong demand. Many participants expect access to their own data that's collected throughout a trial. Perhaps that's unsurprising to many people. And just this general global shift towards patient-centric trials and shared medical decision-making, as well as increased access to digital portals, which helps facilitate the return of these results, and just a general push for better transparency and health data ownership. Next slide. We know from our Perceptions and Insights study, which is a global large survey that is done every 2 years at CISCRP, that individual study results are of the most interest for participants in a clinical research study. 81% mention that this is, the thing that they're most interested in receiving after completing participation. And in terms of what kinds of data that they'd be most interested in receiving, in order of interest is blood tests, imaging results, genetic test results, vitals, and doctor visit notes. So clearly the demand is certainly there. However, there are challenges in terms of returning individual data. There's regulatory complexity, different rules across different countries, and often unclear guidance. There's operational burden. You're coordinating across sometimes hundreds of sites, data cleaning challenges, as well as ensuring that the data portal that you would be potentially returning the data through is secure. Resourcing and scalability is obviously going to be a concern anytime there's an investment required for a new initiative, and that could be particularly challenging for smaller sponsors or really large global trials. Timing of data return is also a challenge with the balance between making sure participants have access to their data as early as possible without, risking unblinding or biasing the outcomes of the trial, as well as data misinterpretation. Context is really important, and I know that's something that will be discussed later, as well as the potential of returning non-validated results like an exploratory biomarker. And lastly, of course, results do not necessarily equal medical advice. So there's, the challenge or risk that folks will interpret the results as medical advice rather than deferring to a qualified clinician. Next slide. That said, there are some organizations that are helping to, make IDR a reality or are currently returning individual results. The MRCT, for example, developed, a task force and created guidance back in 2022 to help organizations with IDR. They have a lot of resources and tools there. I put the website of each of these below. Some of their key recommendations include planning early, allowing for participants to opt in or out of their data return, and to return data based on clinical relevance, validity, and personal utility. Facilitate is another organization. They have an IMI project focused on enabling IDR within a more regulatory landscape, focused on bringing, a complex and fragmented landscape kind of together and creating a framework for folks to execute IDR. Their key recommendations are similar to MRCT, planning early, allowing for opt-in and out, and being sort of thoughtful about what data should be returned and not necessarily returning it all automatically, and having that flexibility for different trials and context. Pfizer is a company that has, been public about their commitment to IDR. They do it at scale. They report that their data is returned around 1 year after trial ends through an online portal. Patients must opt in. They are providing the context, and some examples of the data they include are labs, vitals, adverse events, treatment assignments. Also worth mentioning, but not included on this slide just for space, Transcelerate. They are also helping to create resources and sort of the infrastructure to help with alignment to make IDR more scalable, more easily scalable. And also sort of more recently, the NIH has announced that they're developing a two-part policy that will require the return of not only aggregate study results to participants, but also individual study results to participants in NIH-funded clinical research studies. So definitely the momentum is continuing. And with that, I will turn it over to Sudipta.
Thanks, Kim. I thought I would shift gears a little bit for us and talk a bit about still maintaining health literacy principles as a part of our individual data return template. Health literacy in general is something that I think oftentimes, if you're not in this space, it tends to be a bit of like a buzzword, and it means a lot of different things to different people based on your experience with it. So I thought I would start here with just a general definition of what I mean when I say health literacy. The definition here is the degree to which individuals have the ability to find, understand, and use the information they need to make the right healthcare related decisions for them or for others. And I always like to include this graphic because I think it helps people understand some of these words that you tend to hear in the health literacy space. I have it in the name of our Center of Excellence, health literacy and plain language. Plain language really is, am I understanding the words, or the words that are being used, words that I can understand at the reading level that I have? Readability is a little bit different. Is it a document that I can look at and it's something I want to read? It's something I can read. It's laid out in a way that is engaging and interesting to me. but health literacy is really pulling it all together. So not only can I read it, not only can I understand it, I've really kind of put it together and I can use that information to go make the right healthcare decisions for me. Next slide, please. I wanted to just briefly touch on this for those who may not be as familiar with the world of clinical trial data return of any sort. So what I think maybe more people are familiar with is what we call the results plain language summary, or PLS. This is the aggregate summarized of the full study population summary that happens at the end of a trial and is currently a regulatory requirement in the EU and the UK. This is the only to date plain language centric form of data return that has been around now for about a decade or so, in terms of really helping patients understand, what happened in the trial, who was in the trial, why was it done, and what were the results as a whole for the trial. But with individual data return, there are some similarities, of course, but the differences are major and really drive how the template that we worked on together with CISCRP and patients really follow as much of those guidances that Kim mentioned as possible as well. The biggest thing is obviously it's personal, it's specific, it's on an individual basis. And so one of the key things too is that you have to treat this a bit more delicately than you do a results PLS. A person may get their IDR document and it may require them to be more directly communicative with their own healthcare professionals that they see. It may prompt changes to their healthcare, whereas a results PLS that's covering a study population of tens to hundreds to thousands of people is more informational and not really something that gives them something actionable. And of course, something that Kim also mentioned too, I really wanted to touch base on here is the opt-in process. I think it was the Harvard MRCT toolkit on this that really kind of highlighted the importance of opt-in being a continuous process throughout the trial. It's very often that participants may change their mind. They may come in and say, I don't want my data. I don't want to see all of this, and then change their mind at a different point in the trial. They may do the reverse, or it may change throughout. And that's very different from results PLS. A results PLS, due to the regulatory requirement, can be found online from a lot of sponsors. Our own aggregate results PLS are found on our Biogen trialtransparency.com. And really, when you go there, you can search any of our completed trials for summaries. There is no true consent process the way that there has to be for individual data return. Next slide, please. Thank you. But despite there being some very stark differences between the two, what really still grounds the both of them is the use of health literacy principles. So a main one, we lead with empathy. We are extremely grateful for the contribution that our trial participants have given us through their participation. And in both of our documents, so IDR and our results PLS, we always start with our thank you statements for their participation. But there is a slight difference with the individual data return because we are more directly addressing the participant. So you'll see in an example I'm about to show, you'll see a lot of you and your results and your data, which is not something that you would see as much in a results PLS. The other reason why I really wanted to showcase kind of that Venn diagram on the previous slide is that there still should be consistency between the two. Both of these are types of data return, results return. They're both coming after a participant joins a trial. And so we want to make sure that the language, the terminology that's used in both are as consistent as possible. At Biogen, to help us do that, we have developed a plain language glossary over the years, and both of these documents and the template that Mariana will discuss in a little bit was designed based off of that glossary. And that way we can have the same definitions to describe, for example, an assessment that we're reporting on, or even an outcome measure that we're reporting on in plain language. And then I mentioned this a bit earlier too, but really reinforcing privacy and trust issues here. In the individual data return, we have a lot of statements that you'll see in the template about shared decision making. I think I saw a question come in maybe in the Q&A or the chat that someone mentioned, how do we balance that line of empowerment versus misinterpretation, or as Kim said, results don't equal medical advice. So we really want to make sure that that language is in the template. As put in quotes there, you may want to share this report with your doctor. You may want to talk about this with your doctor. And of course, also data privacy. Data privacy is a much bigger concern with an IDR versus an aggregate results PLS. So we have language that we put into our template that makes that very clear, that we don't know who you are. We don't have your personal information. Your information, your ID has been de-identified. That is very important for this to really, I think, be successful in a way that is still trustworthy. And then limitations. So I feel like in a results PLS, limitations aren't often discussed. And I think in an IDR, this is really important because you're giving participants more granular information. In an example I'm going to show you, this could be in data tables over multiple time points. And maybe something happened with data collection along the way. And you have to really help the reader understand what that really meant. I'll talk about that in just a second. And then visuals. Visuals are very important. They're a general health literacy principle. Visuals help the average reader understand things better. That being said, we have to make sure that we're using them carefully. So color coding is something we do in both our IDR and our results PLS. But something else that's a little different in the IDR, and I just briefly mentioned that too, are things like data tables. If you think about blood tests or other data points that were collected at multiple time points over an extended period of time, that could easily result in lengthy data tables that spread over multiple pages. And whenever you get into situations like that's where you lose a reader. It gets more challenging for someone to look at a page of just an entire table. So we did our best to really make things as clear as possible in that regard. And then again, this last one I think is one of the most important principles and goes back to the question in the chat about empowerment versus misinterpretation, and that is providing context. Something that you will not see in either individual data return documents or our results PLS is really some kind of hardcore interpretation. We can't tell you, this drug worked better for you than this other drug in a certain way. However, we can't also give you data points and not tell you what that means. In that case, it's not really empowering and it's not helpful. And so providing context in a way that still isn't promotional, isn't overpromising is really important. And actually, if we go to the next slide, I can showcase what I mean by that. On the left here, I just wanted to show a quick kind of snippet comparison of just our current individual return template and then one of our results PLS. Before I go into specifics, I'll say, both are visual. On the right, these results PLSs, we've been doing them for a long time. They have a full graphical template that looks very different, has been developed and changed and updated over many, many years. But what I really wanted you to see here is, we have headers that are clearly telling you what you're looking at. We start off with a thank you statement that you'll see on the right side. A similar thank you statement that's a bit more personal appears on the first page of our individual data return as well. And then on the left, looking at our individual data return, what I did want to point out as an example for context is, so what you're seeing here is we're providing data in two different formats. You're seeing the bar graph to showcase the EDSS scores. So EDSS, this was an example from a multiple sclerosis study that stands for Expanded Disability Status Scale. And what you'll see in the text, it might be a little hard to read, but you'll see in the second paragraph, it tells you the EDSS score ranges from 0 to 10, with a higher score meaning greater disability. the results are shown below. And so you see we've got two different formats of visuals to help the reader understand what their values were and how it looked over time over their visits. It's also telling you what the number means without telling you something like, oh, that meant that at week 12, I was doing better on this drug than something else. It's just telling you exactly what the scale is meant to tell you, which is that a higher number means greater disability. And so that context, I think, is key in helping readers still understand and feel empowered that we're giving them results that they can then maybe take to their doctor and discuss further if they'd like, without any type of promotional or overpromising language. And with that, I will hand it back to Jasmine.
Thanks so much, Kim and Sidipta. I appreciate it. So as we continue our conversation, we want to dive in and explore a little bit more about this opportunity we had to discuss with patients and care partners about their thoughts and feedback on the Biogen created individual data return template. Before we do that, I want to introduce the UPCAB itself. So on the next slide, I want to provide a little bit of background for everyone. So UPCAB, as I think I mentioned earlier, stands for Underrepresented Populations Community Advisory Board. It's a really important initiative. It started back in 2020 when Biogen engaged CISCRP to help plan a standing virtual advisory board among patients and advocates from communities that were historically underrepresented in clinical research. And the goal was really to help or leverage feedback to advise on the development of engagement materials and different strategies aimed at improving diversity in clinical trials. And since then, it continues to serve as a great resource. So it's really evolved to include individuals from various patient communities and backgrounds. It does everything from helping to inform the development of patient-facing clinical trial materials, as we're going to be talking about, but also inclusive R&D strategies and more. So recently, last December, we engaged the UPCAB and convened them to review and provide feedback on this template that Biogen was developing, an individual data return template. And they were sent the material in advance of the meeting so that they had time to review on their own. And then we met virtually to discuss the document in a bit more detail, but we also spent some time really talking to them a bit more about the general concept of returning data back to study participants. And so the key points or the key objectives of this particular engagement with the UPCAB was really to evaluate attitudes and preferences related to the return of individual study data as a whole, solicit specific feedback on the sample report example that was shared, and then ultimately use that feedback to identify ways to optimize content, language, layout, and format of the report itself. So on the next slide, we can just share, a high-level overview of who was able to attend this session, and actually it was all 11 members of the UPCAB at the time. And you can see here, again, this is kind of a high-level snapshot of who took part in the session. We had 11 people total, mix of both patients and care partners. There was also representation from many different patient communities, as you can see, lupus, AMR, SMA, Alzheimer's disease, FA, ALS, and Parkinson's disease. We also had a mix of races and ethnicities represented, ages, genders, and then we did have the majority actually of the UPCAB did have some degree of clinical trial experience, whether that was interventional or observational in nature, which really was helpful for this particular conversation. But we did have a small handful of people that had no prior clinical trial experience, which was also really beneficial because we were able to understand and assess from, a trial naive perspective what they would want to see or what they would expect if they were to have participated in a study. On the next slide, before we dive into kind of specific feedback that people had, we opened up the conversation with them more generally about, attitudes and preferences related to sharing back individual study data. And as you can imagine, this was the concept itself was really highly valued. It was it was viewed as a way that sponsors could communicate thanks and appreciation for the people that were involved in the research. And it also really was a way to convey transparency in the research process, which was also highly valued. When it comes to the most relevant data, obviously there's tons and tons of data that's collected from a study participant throughout the course of a trial. And, we really wanted to better understand, and one of the main objectives was what data mattered truly most to people. And what we heard from everyone was it was really mostly the information or the data that was most closely related to their condition and ultimately any symptom change or progression, as well as any data that was truly tied to the primary endpoint of the study. And throughout the conversation, it became pretty apparent that too much data or an iron level from every single visit, every single blood pressure that was ever captured may ultimately not be super impactful for people, and may really just overwhelm them and not be as useful to the participant. And on that same line of thinking, we talked to them about the volume of data. How much is too much? And so obviously people have different preferences and different interest levels in data as a whole. And so some people were a bit more interested and wanted all the raw data. Others, primarily felt like, again, if you could just stick with those key metrics, data related to the condition itself, any progression or symptom change, and then data really most closely tied to the primary endpoints of the study, that would be a sufficient volume of data to return back to patients. As Sudipta mentioned, visually representing data can be very meaningful and help make it a bit easier to digest. That was echoed here as well. Visually representing data whenever possible was a great way people felt to be able to see trends over time. And also just identify and then digest things in a different way. Oftentimes in a table format, some people may miss key metrics or key points. And so visually representing data was highly valued. Timelines, again, I think we all know, and the UpCap participants understood that research itself takes quite some time. And so as such, it might be, several months or even years before a study participant would ultimately be returned their data. And so, while this was disappointing, and you can kind of see on the quote that's highlighted here, how frustrating that could be, it just really, the point was made to set clear expectations from the start around when and how data would ultimately be returned, just to help level set so that no one was waiting and anticipating them sooner than they perhaps were expected. So setting expectations was key. The other thing that came about was just the need to really accelerate data return whenever possible, particularly for those with progressive illnesses. So our ALS and Alzheimer's disease patient in particular, we're talking about how important it is to be able to receive data back where it's still clinically relevant, but also that they, cognitive decline hadn't progressed to a point where they were no longer really able to utilize it. Sensitive data was another piece that we talked about. And, again, kind of there's been some mention in the chat about making sure that this is presented with as much sensitivity as we can and compassion. So people realize that the return data may ultimately indicate that their health had worsened or that symptoms had declined. And so it was just very important to everybody that this be presented with compassion. It could also be used as an opportunity to, again, express gratitude on behalf of the study, to say thank you for all of the contributions that people have made. Add a disclaimer to, of course, always talk to their doctor for interpretation of these results. But additionally, it was helpful to include recommendations for different resources. So whether that be mental health support, connections with different advocacy groups, just really making sure that this information, if it's presented, and it could be distressing to someone, that there were resources in place. On the next slide, I want to highlight some of the key themes that, as we were reviewing and getting feedback on the IDR template itself, emerged. And you'll see a lot of these, kind of aligns very strongly with and really reinforce the health literacy principles that Sudipta presented a little bit ago. So I'll go through each. The first was, as I just mentioned, really be transparent with timing. Setting expectations is something that we hear kind of throughout, not just from the UpCab, but in general when we speak to patients, just how setting expectations can really make a participation experience more meaningful and positive overall. So it was important to just clearly communicate when and how someone would ultimately expect their data to be returned. This idea of personalizing language, which I know Sudipta mentioned, consistently using the term you and your data when discussing, data points throughout the template was really important. It really reinforced that this was their individual data. It was not aggregate. And it also served as a way to make the document a bit more personal. Empathy, again, communicating with empathy when you're delivering data that could be distressing and more sensitive to people. Anything really that indicated progression. So like strength tests for ALS, speech, cognitive assessments for Alzheimer's disease. Really important to just use that sensitive language and include those referrals and supportive resources. Again, connections to a PAG, mental health resources, etc. To not, again, overwhelm people, as we've mentioned, really trying to make sure that the IDR prioritized the most meaningful data for participants. So not everything in the kitchen sink, really making sure that the data that's shared back is primarily related to the study's endpoints and the person's own disease and condition, and not auxiliary data like various lab values that may not be impactful or meaningful. Ensuring understanding was also a big topic. As always, the importance of plain language and easy to digest information was stressed throughout the conversation. Participants really emphasized that if the sponsor was going to take the steps to share back this data, it was really key that it would be accessible and easy to understand for folks. Another important point that emerged was just providing context where appropriate, especially given that there could be a decent amount of time between when the person participated and when they're actually receiving these results. So making sure that there were some reminders in the text around the background information on the study, what would a normal range be for XYZ lab value, the number of study arms, why data was collected, could be really helpful context and help just improve and enhance understanding. Designing the document again for easy navigation was critical. So making sure that the report itself had clear titles and headers, used appropriate visuals, just so that people can quickly and easily navigate, and find the information that was most important to them would go a long way. On the next slide, continuing here with our key themes, visualizing data, again, another way to just make sure that data was digestible and meaningful, leveraging visuals like line graphs to convey patterns or trends was very helpful. There was a tendency to want to avoid other kind of graphics like line shading, just kind of people really seem to prefer that simple line graph. That was kind of the most preferred of the different options that we had shared. The idea of an appendix, I thought this was a great idea, was suggested. It was, for those people that really just loved the data, wanted every bit of it back. An appendix was suggested as a way to kind of neatly bookend some of that more robust, very detailed data that a lot of people may just be overwhelmed by, not necessarily want to see it, but may be of great interest and value to other people. So again, an appendix was suggested as a way to do that. There was some discussion too around how to further optimize data tables. So if data tables are going to be included in the main section of the report, avoiding having them span multiple pages whenever possible, making sure there's not all decimal points that kind of just get confusing, avoiding repeat headers, providing with gratitude. Again, this was just really reiterated throughout that it would be to make sure that the sponsor always takes the opportunity to express thanks when they're returning individual data and really amplify that throughout the document as much as possible. Secure delivery was something that it may go without saying, but data security was definitely raised, and to make sure that that data, especially if it was sensitive or included information about their condition, it was delivered securely to them, and a portal was thought to be the best way to safely and securely return data. And finally, enhancing data return via digital and technology or technological tools was raised. And this might be kind of a 2.0 of the initiative, but there was a lot of interest in whether or not a digital platform or technology could be used to make the data a bit more able to engage. And so, this could also be a way to make data more accessible for individuals with limited physical abilities, or diagnosed with a condition that slowly over time they lose certain physical abilities. So being able to engage with the data virtually or expanding text, zooming in, this was something that was really exciting for a lot of people. All right, and finally, before I turn it over to Mariana, this was just some kind of key takeaways from the sample IDR report that was shared. Overall, it was a really well-received document. People appreciated seeing a sponsor sharing back this data post-trial. Some of the key likes included, clear headers and different sections that made the document feel really easy to navigate. There was plain language used throughout, which everyone highly valued. The charts and graphs were utilized throughout. So again, it made the data just a bit more easier to digest. And as Sudipta, I think in the example shared, there was both the chart and the graph, which, appealed to both people. So kind of the different formats was appreciated. And then there was an inclusion of a thank you. So I don't know how well you can see it. It's pretty small here, but that was the first thing so if someone opened it up, thank you is really front and center, which people loved. Areas of opportunity, people felt like some sections still felt a bit too dense. Data tables, they felt again, and Marianne will speak in more detail to the feedback, but just too much numbers, could be maybe formatted a bit more optimally to help tell a story a bit better. We heard line graphs, again, without shading. Simple line graphs were really helpful, and that was kind of the preferred method to show data trends over time. And, again, despite the thank you being front and center, people really wanted this to just be further enhanced throughout the document. So just continuing to express gratitude throughout was key. All right. So with that, I will turn it over to Mariana.
Thank you. Next slide, please. So I wanted to make sure everyone had sort of a lay of the land of what the document looked like that we handed out, because I always find that sort of helps my mental model when you discuss something. So it's shown on the left here. It starts with a big title and header. There's a greeting section under the thank you that starts, "Dear participant." There's a study description that sort of lightly touches on the study design. We have changed, based on feedback, the template a little bit since we created the one that's shown on the left, but there are now separate sections that have information about the report. One is usage, in the sense of please go over this with your doctor, and one of which is data privacy, which goes over the ways in which their identity is protected when this information travels from us to them. And then in the middle, there's all of the data with the plain language context. And then we added a second thank you towards the end. And then there's a resources section, excuse me, that has information about this trial and other Biogen clinical research. Next slide, please. So our approach to this advisory board was to create a starting point document, something for people to react to and respond to, rather than the tyranny of the blank page. So it was not the most finished, polished product, because we didn't want it to seem like feedback was unwelcome. We tried to be thoughtful about the example data we used. We didn't want to go very specific and only select one disease area, for instance, and then have concepts that were unfamiliar to the group. So we did a mix across disease areas, including things that we thought would be a little more understandable than some of the complex options that are out there, but without going into like having fictional characters or things like that could make it cartoonish and, not respect the gravity. As folks have mentioned, we also wanted to test the limits at both ends of the complexity spectrum. So we did include data points that were like one number every visit, as well as ones that were several measures at every visit put together into one number, and how that was to get feedback on how that was received as overwhelming versus useful. And also, we also wanted to include questions with indirect value. The technology example that was just mentioned is a good example. We can't necessarily implement the true interactivity this early in the project, but there are things like that if we know people want them, we can add it to the roadmap, and we can bring it up when people are saying, well, how do you know that people want that? Well, we know because we asked. Next slide, please. Going into the cab, I was really nervous that they would tell us that it was terrible and they hated it, which they did not. And in fact, the humbling feedback is what made it feel best. The decimal point issue has been brought up already. We had a table that had lots of decimal points, and someone said, hey, that makes it look cluttered. And it was fairly embarrassing, but he was right. And that's something you can internalize and see when it applies in similar situations. My real favorite feedback of the whole session that sort of flipped a switch for me was this second one. We had included data from a biomarker, and in the graph, it's a newish biomarker that's not really used in the clinic. They wouldn't have heard of it from their regular doctor. And so we had a section saying there isn't a normal range for this, and your regular doctor may not use this. And someone spoke up and said, if there's no normal range and there's no value in it being used for making medical decisions, then what's the importance in the study? Why is it being measured? Which obviously is a great question. And we're sitting here and we read the study protocol and we know why it got added, but that really captures what it is that we need to be not doing and doing better with these documents. There was feel-good feedback as well. There was good feedback on the formatting and the different sections and headers, and there was a table of contents so folks know what they're getting and they can skip ahead if they need to. Someone said that for anyone who uses Epic or MyChart, it's very similar and it's easy to read and see the trends. That was something that we had discussed when we were designing the template, and it was sort of like we were hoping to hear, I use MyChart and this is familiar to me. So it was great to hear that. And then at one point someone said, I'm all in, which was also very vindicating. They're excited to get data, we're excited to return it, and they said it's a great idea and we agree. Next slide, please. So the limitations with a template that we presented to the group are conceptual and logistical. The conceptual issues with the advisory board itself, we were in a position where in the long run, we want to limit the overlap with the results plain language summary that Sudipta described. And the reason for this is it's actually a concept from databases, but when you have the same information in two places, if one of them changes slightly, it becomes confusing. And so we're trying to put in this template, in the IDR template, exactly what they need to know related to the data, with the hopes that they will use it in conjunction with the results plain language summary. But at the community advisory board, we didn't have a results plain language summary. So we got a lot of feedback of, it would be nice to know this. And we were like, yeah, it would. And you're right. Of course, there's always the issue that every person is different. You ask 11 people, you get 11 answers, but there were definitely things that rose out that we could follow. And then logistical things for the real life return that came up during the meeting were the delivery timeline, as folks have spoken to. There's intellectual property and scientific integrity issues that prevent us from returning as soon as we could. Some of the feedback about graphs or tables that span several pages, we are currently limited by our format. We're using PDFs. It's I think it's a good choice for now. They're very portable. They stay the same when you print them. You can zoom in on them with your existing software. But people raised the question, could we make it interactive? Could you overlay things and slice and dice? And maybe, and we're looking into it, but there's a lot of organizational complexity. Next slide, please. So we had this in December, and the things that we have already integrated is the addressing the participant as you threw out. We went in with a mix. We've clarified the language around privacy and how their identity is protected. We are explaining why certain data is returned per the excellent feedback, and that includes data significance. And then we, as I said, added the second thank you. We don't think it's enough, but we're working on it. So things based on the timing, we're sort of unable to have done everything so far. So there are things that we're planning and things that sort of haven't come up in our current timeline. So we are working on including the support resources to go along with information that could be upsetting. We're working on our dramatic gesture of gratitude. One of the participants called it a big page with a heart on it, which I think captures the drama that we're looking to achieve in terms of like we're really grateful. We appreciate your commitment. What you're doing is so valuable. We're reformatting tables. We're in discussions about the data appendix that has sort of its own ins and outs. Someone requested adding administration dates, as in dates when you got the injection or took the pill. And then we also got some feedback about clarifying points of contact if they have questions about the participation. So that's it for me. And I'm handing it off to Jasmine and Israel. I'm looking forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thanks, Mariana. So the next kind of to round out our conversation, we wanted to spend some time speak with Israel and get his perspective on what it was like to participate in this meeting. So Israel, I'd love to kick our conversation off by asking you, we've heard a lot about our interpretation of the findings of our conversation, but I'd love to hear from you, what's most important to you when thinking about returning individual data for yourself as well as the broader Parkinson's disease community? Oh, I think you're on mute. Sorry.
I think the most important part is treating the trial like a partnership, to be able to basically begin with the end in mind. You were just sharing as far as what do you want, or not necessarily what do you want from the study, is what are you going to share with the patient in the study? And one thing that's important for me is we're not volunteers, we're participants. So that's where the shared responsibility comes for the organizations to be able to say, this is what you went through. We told you this is what we would get to you, and here it is. So that data that can be shared, we can work on a bit more. But I think the importance of being told you're a part of this study, you're an important part of what we want to accomplish. And I think that's all we want.
Yeah. So really kind of setting expectations and making sure that throughout there's a partnership built throughout. Yeah, absolutely.
Right.
And, I think again, expressing that gratitude, really conveying appreciation throughout will hopefully move towards doing that.
I was going to say, Jasmine,
Yeah,
just
please.
quickly, and I think talk about establishing rapport and a connection with the patient community. Imagine you've got X pharmaceutical company. They're known for being able to share back the information. Patient community stays abreast of things that are going on. So could you imagine saying XYZ pharma company was doing this, or this is the research, this is what I received back from them. You might consider participating next time if there's a trial available.
Yeah, just kind of speaking to how that transparency and knowing, that the results are shared back, how that really does trickle down and could ultimately influence future participation for people.
Right.
Yeah,
That's
absolutely. I'm curious if there's any insights or learnings that came out of this conversation. I know it was a little while ago, but anything that really surprised you or that you, even if it didn't surprise you, you really agreed with or aligned with?
One of the things that I'm a stickler for is don't dumb down or water down what you're trying to get to people. If the person needs help, they can contact someone within the organization or medical center or wherever. Because I'd rather them, and you're not talking like the language that's in the protocol that is researcher based, but to be able to say this is what we have for you, rather than saying, okay, so like Mariana was saying, cartoonish things that would to me be offensive, honestly, because like, you wanted me to participate, but you're wanting to show me things that I don't. What does this prove? So I think just staying true to what the organization does. And I tell you what, then it speaks a lot to what Biogen does, and it's very appreciated.
Yeah. Well, and I think to your point, sharing back the information in a way that's transparent and in plain language, but doesn't gloss over anything or doesn't make it just simply not meaningful or potentially offensive to someone. Absolutely.
Absolutely.
Anything else that we haven't necessarily spoke to or that you think is most important, that sponsors like Biogen and others should really think about and consider when they're working on these initiatives to return study data back to individuals?
The term I use a lot is shared responsibility, not only from the patient community, but the research community. Because if we're not in it together, it the same, the status quo stays the same. But reaching out to people and saying, this is what we're doing. Can you help us? And you're talking about starting from the beginning of the trial or the protocol rather than saying, okay, here's the data. How can we get it out to you? And that's where PCORI, Patient-Centered Outcome Research Institute, has very clearly said from the very beginning, we need a person living with the disease or a person that's impacted by what they're dealing with as far as caregivers, et cetera. That makes a huge difference because they are supposed to be part of the whole process. And that's where, when we talk about data results, we know that somebody's been, not everybody would know, but if you ask, there's a person who's dealing with this disease process who was involved from the beginning. It was an afterthought.
No, absolutely. And I think so. I know we have a lot of Q&A that have come into the chat, but Israel, I actually might turn it to you for one that caught my eye. How much of an impact do you think that ultimately, having a clinical trial return individual data has on a participant's overall experience from your perspective?
I think it's very historically what has happened is we don't get anything back. We wait and we wait. And honestly, I've been in quite a few trials and nothing. But I think the importance of having the data goes beyond anything else. It's that trust issue. You told us you would do this, and here it is, and I'm willing to provide whatever information you need moving forward. So the importance is something that we can't stress enough. It's if you, my dad used to say, how were you treated? Were you treated with respect? And those were two questions that anywhere that I went, that I traveled, that I was involved in, those were his questions. Were you treated well? And were you treated with respect? And that's basically what the patient community really wants, honestly.
Well, it really kind of reinforces what you shared earlier was you want to be treated like a partner, right? You don't want people to feel like a subject or just a volunteer. They're really a participant and a true partner in the research. Without people participating, the research doesn't get done. I think this, sharing back data does go a long way in communicating that. Excellent. Thank you, Israel, for sharing your perspectives. Thank you so much for sharing that. I wanted to open a little bit up to other Q&A that have come in. I know we talked a little bit about this, but and again, Israel or others panelists, one question is individual data return really valuable to participants if it comes 1+ years potentially after a trial is is completed? Any thoughts on that?
Peter, Jasmine, I'll answer that one.
Please.
I think if you're given, let's say, okay, the protocol is scheduled for 2 years. Even some may say, what's too much? If you can tell the participant what your timeline looks like, you're already setting them up to be on your side. You're not going to say, oh, we promised you, but we never told you what we do. So you can't blame us. I think just keeping that in mind, because most of us know a trial is not going to be 6 months. You've got to recruit, you've got to work your protocol, et cetera. People who participate in clinical trials are pretty savvy as far as, what information they're wanting back from the study. And like me, I'm willing to wait 2-3 years for the proteomics study that I was in. So just keeping, if you have that contact information saying we're still working on this, but we'll get to you as soon as we get our information.
Well said. Well said. One other question that I think we probably have time for, and maybe Mariana or Sudipta, what are some of the biggest challenges you've encountered trying to get IDR operationalized? I know, Mariana, you spoke to some of those, but any thoughts on that question?
I think, excuse me, there's every day you try to answer a question and you discover another question instead of finding an answer. And excuse me, for me, as sort of like a perfectionist, it is hard to do this, but we have to sort of forge ahead without being perfect because otherwise we can't get anywhere. And I would say that's the biggest struggle.
Yeah.
I also just want to add that it is a huge, huge kind of teamwork effort here. Mariana and I, up until the IDR project got going, I don't think we knew each other. I don't think we had any reason to interact with each other. And it goes to show you how, at a company like Biogen, there's so many moving pieces and parts to something as all encompassing as IDR that it is a team effort. And I think at Biogen, what's been great is everyone's excited about it. And that really helps us discover how to truly make this operational.
Well said. And I think, Mariana, as you were speaking, one of the things that came to my mind was like, don't let perfect be the enemy of good. And like, this is a good initiative. It's important. Forge ahead, as you said. So that's a wonderful way to kind of cap our conversation. I want to say thank you so much to our panelists. We really appreciate each of you sharing your perspectives. It's a wonderful conversation. We didn't have time to address all the Q&A, but there's a lot here. So what we'll do is we'll take that back and answer those offline. Really appreciate everyone's active participation in the discussion. If there's any questions that you have as a result of this conversation, this webinar, please feel free to reach out to Kim, myself, Mariana, or Sudipta. We really thank you all for joining us today. And the recording of this will also be posted to the CISCRP website, so we can check it out at your leisure later. But thank you so much to everyone, and have a great rest of your day. Thanks for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.